Good evening. I'm Nancy Williams, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of South Carolina, and I am pleased to welcome you to our What Would Fair Maps Look Like redistricting event. For those of you who may be less familiar with the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. We believe that democracy needs to be carefully nurtured and fiercely defended by an informed, active citizenry. Although we neither support nor oppose political candidates or political parties, we are political in that we work to influence public policy through advocacy. Here in South Carolina, we have a long-standing reputation of working on good government issues, including redistricting. The purpose of tonight's event is to present the maps that we, the League, have drawn and will be submitting to the state legislature. The League has been watching very carefully the redistricting process in South Carolina, and we have been asking for maps that prioritize voters' best interests. Although we had hoped that a independent redistricting commission would have been established to draw these maps this year, this is not the case. However, we hope that our state legislature will be listening to citizen input, including the submission of our maps. Before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping items. First of all, if you have not already done so, please mute yourself and turn off your video. Also, if you have questions in the course of the presentation, please pose your questions to our host using the chat function. At the end of the presentation, we will try to answer a few of them as time permits. Also, if any of you experience technical difficulties, you'll be pleased to know that this event is being recorded so that you can look at it later at your convenience on our website. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Shana Howell. Shana is the co-chair of the League's redistricting work group. Shana.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited about showing you our maps tonight. And before we do that, we just want to briefly cover the whys and the hows of redistricting, the implications that the redistricting process can have on our government, and the influences that are shaping that process this year. So why do we redraw the lines of our districts every 10 years? As our population grows, we don't add more representatives. They just come to represent more people. States can lose or gain representation according to their population changes relative to the other 49 states. So many of you may remember in 2010, South Carolina gained a 7th congressional district due to population growth. This process is the same in the state legislature, but you can see here that each South Carolina representative represents around 40,000 residents. The U.S. Constitution requires a census every 10 years. You'll remember that it happened in 2020, but because of COVID, the census process and the data release was all delayed this year. So we got the data in August, several months after we would normally get it following a census. And our population changes, obviously. People move, and where they're moving to is not even. If there is not a way to redraw the lines to redistrict, then those districts will no longer be equally sized, and then voters will no longer be equally represented. So we're going to look at some population changes in our state over the past 10 years. These are the population deviations in South Carolina House districts. South Carolina as a whole crossed the 5 million mark in population. The coast experienced a lot of growth. Horry County had the most growth at 31%, Charleston County at 17%. You'll see up here that Rock Hill had a lot of growth, the suburb of Charlotte area. And so those districts will have to change as they'll shrink in geographic size since there are more people, there's more population. These are the Senate maps, sort of a similar view. And you'll see along the I-95 corridor that there was a lot of population loss relative to the rest of the state there. And this is a largely rural and minority population that lives in this corridor. And then here are those views for the congressional districts. You'll see Congressional District 1, which is the coastal area. A lot of Charleston experienced a lot of growth. So who redraws the district lines? I'm sure many of you know that in South Carolina, like most other states, legislators draw their own districts. Organization for the redistricting effort takes place in the Judiciary Committee in each chamber. They set rules called redistricting criteria for redistricting. And the criteria really guide how much the process reflects things like protecting self-interest versus other redistricting priorities, such as communities of interest, which we'll discuss in a minute. Some states have instituted an independent redistricting commission to do this work. And the League of Women Voters supports those efforts and supports having IRCs, but the states that have been able to do this largely are states that have the ability for voters to put a ballot initiative on the ballot at election time, and South Carolinians do not have that option. I don't think any of us would be surprised that when legislators are given the control over the process, it is hard for them to resist the chance to manipulate the maps to gain an electoral advantage. And that's sort of human nature, and both parties do it. It's not a Republican or Democratic thing. The League's People-Powered Fair Maps campaign is in all 50 states, regardless of who is in power. And we want to see the process improved regardless of the political party in power. In South Carolina, one of our big problems, as you'll soon see, is incumbent gerrymandering, more so than partisan gerrymandering. My co-chair, Dr. Matt Saltzman, and his team at Clemson University have analyzed our maps, and they don't show evidence of extreme partisan gerrymandering. However, we do see incumbent gerrymandering, and we're also concerned that since this is the first year that South Carolina will be going through the redistricting process without the protections afforded by pre-clearance under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that partisan gerrymandering could come into play. So these are really oversimplified examples that show how lines can distort representation so that the governing body doesn't represent the full population as a whole. So in a population of 50 people, you may be able to draw the lines like it was done on this left side so that there is proportional representation, or voters can be cracked or packed so that the legislative body doesn't mirror the population. Like we said, our current district maps do not show extreme partisan bias, but incumbents can use the process to draw lines that would otherwise not make a lot of sense. For instance, they may do it to avoid getting drawn into a district with another incumbent, called incumbent pairing, or they could draw potential opponents out of their district, which does happen in South Carolina. So in this fictional district, you can see that a Republican, because the lines have been drawn to cut out a lot of the red dots, a Republican couldn't feasibly win. So the only challenge to a Democratic incumbent would likely be from their own party in a primary, meaning they could probably only get beat to the further left extreme, which would further the polarization inside the governing body. So primaries often also see really low voter turnout. In South Carolina, the average is something like 18% in a primary, meaning a very few voters are determining who will represent a lot of people. If the outcome of a lawmaker's next election is largely predetermined by the district lines, they are less likely to have a challenger from another party. And one very unfortunate byproduct of incumbent gerrymandering is a lack of competition. You may have seen these maps that LWVSC put out a few months ago. They show just how competitive our legislative districts are in South Carolina. In 2020, for example, only 9 out of 124 House districts had a competitive election, which we considered a margin of victory of 10 points or less. And the remainder were either completely uncontested or pretty grossly uncompetitive. We can't fault gerrymandering with all of this. There's lots of other issues at play, but we do believe that gerrymandering has played a role. This graphic from the Brennan Center shows the South Carolina's risk of having gerrymandered maps this year, and they rate that as high based on 3 key factors. One is South Carolina has failed to implement any redistricting reform. The second is that South Carolina was one of the states that was subject to pre-clearance. And finally, we have one party in charge of all 3 levels, all 3 branches of government in South Carolina, all or House and Senate and government. I shouldn't say 3 branches. So the redistricting process is really complicated, and it only happens every 10 years. So it can be hard for the public to get involved, but it does have serious implications. And the fact that it's harder for the public to understand can make it easier for the legislature to manipulate the process. And this result takes away power from voters and makes polarization worse by creating districts that are more internally homogeneous. So what could new districts look like? District lines are the result of the criteria that are used to draw the districts. Many, but not all, Democrat and Republican legislators want to maintain incumbent protection. So that is going to be listed on their criteria. We explicitly reject that. Our criteria call for the rejection of preferential treatment of political parties or incumbents. And they also, we try to, although we were not trying to make districts that were more competitive, we did reject the possibility that we do reject the possibility that you draw districts for the sole purpose of making them less competitive. We also looked at boundaries of precincts, municipalities, and counties as very important, while also considering other communities of interest. And you'll see some of the ways that we applied these criteria as we move forward. Another really important part of what we did this year is we wanted to sort of walk the talk. We asked for an independent redistricting committee at the state level for the legislature. And although we didn't get it, we wanted to use one to advise our own work. So we worked in consultation with a redistricting advisory committee. These esteemed members from around the state provided input on their own communities of interest and guidance on implementing our criteria as it applied to those communities. And I know several of them are on the call tonight, and I'd like to take just a minute to thank them. If they could please turn their video on so that we can acknowledge them. And Dr. Ann Katia, I believe, is in the room. She's the Dean of the Center for Innovative Learning with Wofford College. Hi, Ann. Charles Mann, I believe, is with us. He's the founder of the Upstate Action Alliance. Hey, Charles. Senator Larry Martin is not with us tonight, but both he and Dr. Doug McTeer were, their input was extremely helpful as former legislators to sort of get that insight from the map room and sort of what to expect going forward. Katarina Moyan, I believe, is here. She's the director of the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy from Winthrop University. Elizabeth Stribling is the Research and Special Projects Coordinator for South Carolina Women in Leadership, which has been a really great partner for us. And Ann Sinclair, the former Columbia City Councilwoman. And I can't see all of you, but thank you so much for being here this evening and for your help throughout this process. It has been very interesting, and in some respects, it was more rushed than we had hoped it to be, just to try to prepare to get these maps into the legislature pretty quickly. So thank you all. And I've got some lines across my screen that I'm not sure how to get rid of, but we'll move forward. And I now want to introduce Dr. John Roof. He is a He is one of our state's most respected redistricting experts for sure, but he's got a lot of other things going for him as well. He has been a longtime supporter of good government, of the League of Women Voters. He's a wonderful policy analyst, and most importantly, he's been a true pleasure to work with, and we're extremely thankful for his time and commitment to us. These maps represent a lot of work. So John, thank you for being here with us.
You're very welcome, Shana.
So with that, I am going to show our first map. The first maps are going to be congressional comparisons. And so on the left, you'll see the current South Carolina congressional map, and on the right, the LWVSC 2021 congressional map. And with the congressional map, I mean, we can see that it passes sort of the eyeball test for a cleaner map, but I'm going to go on and just get a closer look at it, John, and ask you to talk to us a little bit about it. You can definitely see that the map looks cleaner and more compact. We also know that you prioritized keeping counties together, having fewer county splits. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Well, you know, that is a policy decision as much as anything else. But one of the things we hear constantly at public hearings on redistricting is stop splitting my county. Particularly where you split small counties, and you end up at the tail end of somebody's district, and they pay as much attention to you as you would expect them to do, which is precious little. So one of the advantages to having as many whole counties as you can is that you have a stronger voice with your congressperson or your senator or your House member if they are whole districts. The congressional districts, this plan has 6 split counties. The plan adopted in 2011 had 12. So we made a step forward on that.
Yeah, that's great. And it was one thing that our redistricting advisory committee was really clear about as well, that we wanted to try to do. Also, we talked about that our goal in drawing the maps was not to create competitive districts, but we did reject a process that we're reducing competition on purpose as a goal. We rejected that. And there is always some concern that happens. Can you talk about that for a minute? Because I know that District 1 is maintained as a competitive district in this map.
Yeah, it's pretty much a toss-up district. It has a little bit higher BVAP than the current district. When we run it through Dave's redistricting app, it comes out as a very slight Republican lean, but it's basically a toss-up. Go win an election.
Right. And BVAP, for those who have not been studying the maps as much, is the Black voting age population. Correct, right. John? Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm going to move on to the Senate maps unless you wanted to say something else about these.
I just wanted to note that District 6 is still a strong district in which African-American voters will be able to elect a candidate of their choice. It's not a majority Black voting age population, but it is a majority minority district.
Right. And District 6 is currently Congressman Clyburn district. Yes. These are our Senate maps. On the left is currently drawn, and on the right is our proposed map. Again, they pass the eyeball test. I'm going to go for a close-up look on the Senate map. John, so those of us who know you well and know your work over the past few decades know that something that's always at the heart of your redistricting work and was also a goal of ours this year was protecting minority voting influence. I would like to give you the opportunity to sort of talk about how you did that in the Senate map.
Yes, if you think back to the deviation maps that Shana showed earlier, there is a Grand Canyon running down the I-95 corridor. And that is, lowered populations, but most importantly, proportionately lower populations. And that is the area of the state with among the heaviest concentration of minority voters. What we tried to do was where I could draw a majority BVAP district, I did. But if you draw all of the districts only a majority Black, then you begin to have to eliminate some of the opportunity districts that exist now. So in the real world of South Carolina politics, this should pretty much preserve the districts in which African Americans have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice and have been electing Black candidates.
Right. Another thing that we've talked about as it relates to this map is that, when we talked about the congressional map, we talked about prioritizing not splitting counties when possible. And we've also tried to prioritize not splitting municipalities and having fewer split precincts. But sometimes there are other communities that should be considered. We've had the public weigh in with us and with you, and we've listened to recordings of the public hearings that the Senate and the House are hearing about communities of interest. And sometimes there are other communities other than geopolitical boundaries that should be considered. So I was hoping you'd give us a couple of examples of where you prioritize other communities of interest on this map.
Right. Well, one where we did prioritize municipal boundaries was in Spartanburg, where there is a Spartanburg district, whereas now Spartanburg is split up among, I believe, 3 different senators in a city that's not that big. So another place was in Richland County, where District 20 has, for a good while, gone from downtown Columbia all the way up out I-26 up towards past Irmo and up towards Chapin. And we had lots of feedback about drawing a district that takes those 2 very different communities of interest, very different cultures and interests, and brings them down and brought it down much closer to Columbia. That allows us to pair in District 18. We basically, not completely, but basically created a Lexington Richland 5 district in that area. So that was a place where we considered multiple communities of interest. Just about everywhere in the state, you are making choices about conflicting communities of interest. In some places, in theory, you'd like to keep the county whole, but the 2 ends of the county are very different, and they orient towards different larger cities. And so there were places in all of these maps where we made choices on that after getting feedback from all the folks who provided feedback, and listening to the public hearings, and talking to folks who live in those communities specifically about what they thought the community of interest was.
Right. And we talked a lot about sort of coastal areas being a community of interest as well.
Right.
So,
District 43, for example, if you want to talk about communities of interest in South Carolina, yes, you can complain about the shape of that district. But this is not an exercise in aesthetics. And it does cut, I guess that's 3 counties, 4. And that's not ideal. But if you want to talk about a community of interest, and there was lots of testimony about this at the Senate public hearings, there is no more coherent community of interest than in Senate District 43. It is a coastal beach and tourism district. Hard to beat in
Right.
terms of pure community of interest, even though it splits several counties.
Right. I'm going to move on to the house maps unless there's anything else here. All right. These are harder to analyze side by side. There's 124 house districts, and so it can be a little bit difficult to tell what's going on. But the current house map on the left and our proposed house map on the right.
And we had to draw a bunch of new districts because with 500,000 new people in South Carolina, a lot of them concentrated up in the York, Lancaster area, Horry, down in the Charleston area. There were places that no longer support the number of districts that they had. So when you take a closer look at these, if you want a hint on where did that district come from, look at the number and compare it to the old map, and you'll see a District 50 that used to be in Lee and Sumter counties that's now in Horry. There are several places where districts have been created that were not there before. In Horry, in York, in Greenville, Lancaster.
Right.
These are a real challenge to draw.
Sure. Right. Well, and I think that differences in the criteria that we use versus what the legislature is going to use are particularly apparent in the house maps. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, and particularly with us, our goal to not look at, to not have incumbent protection. And then I know you were also able to uncrack some of the incumbent gerrymanders that were in the previous map. So can you walk us through a couple of those?
Right. One of them is in Anderson County that I've been looking at for 20 years and saying, there is a reasonably cohesive, not large enough to draw a Black majority district, but a reasonably cohesive Black community in the city of Anderson and outside the city of Anderson that is split into 3 districts, 3 house districts, all of them with pretty strong white majorities. So those folks have had their power, their ability to influence that district just cracked, split apart. So we drew a district in southern Anderson that puts together those communities in a district where those minority citizens can have a real impact on the election, and perhaps more importantly, on the elected official having to talk to them.
Right.
One of the other things that we did is our criteria call for deviations under 1 person, 1 vote of plus or minus 5%. The House had said they are doing plus or minus 2.5%. The problem with that is it reduces your flexibility. It also leads to you splitting a ton more precincts than if you used a plus or minus 5%. Splitting those precincts can also make it easier to manipulate districts. This
John,
plan,
just really
how-
quick, I don't want to interrupt. I want you to go forward, but just so this deviation of plus or minus 5% is the total population in the state divided by the number of districts, in this case, 124. And that
Right.
gives sort of your ideal target size. And
yeah,
so,
about 41,000.
right. And then deviations of plus or minus 5% from that ideal size.
And that is the constitutionally allowed deviation in most circumstances for House and Senate districts. I finally looked today at the number of split precincts in the 2011 House map. Well, technically voting districts, which are pretty much like precincts. And there were 418 in the House's map in 2011. There were only 9 counties that were not split. This has 12 unsplit counties and only 82 split voter tabulation districts, essentially precincts. So
That's great.
I think that provides, in addition to sort of the general map drawing theories of why it makes life easier, it also makes administration a lot easier. I mean, when you see precincts chopped to dickens, the folks at the Elections Commission go crazy over it because they have to reassign everyone after every redistricting to new districts. People get confused at the polling place. They don't know what district they live in. They don't know where they're supposed to go vote, although it would be the same place, but they don't know who they're voting for simply because their precinct is chopped into 2 or more districts.
Right, right. Real quickly, John, the Anderson district that you were talking about, do you know that number right off the top of your head?
I believe
okay
it's
if you don't.
9 in this draw.
Okay, okay.
I'm too old to remember districts.
This is a very hard question. I see 9 right up here.
Yes.
And we can look at that later as well.
And that's almost the perfect compact district.
That's a nice looking district. Yes. John, this has been great. I really appreciate you walking us through the maps. Did you have anything else? And we want to be clear, and you've been clear, and we know that there is no ideal map. Nobody's going to be happy with every single district, even if you're talking about just one person. So we're not looking for an ideal map. We are looking for a better, more fair, transparent process for voters. And, I think our maps illustrate a way to do it that is keeping the voters' best interest centered. And so, I really want to thank you for helping us, be able to bring this vision to fruition.
Well, and I would welcome anyone who doesn't like these maps to draw their own. And, that's not just sort of do your own. It's also because maybe you can draw a better map than I have. I mean, everyday citizens in some other states where they've had open mapping processes have drawn better districts than the experts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really cool point. So these maps are going to be available on our website at lwvsc.org in the next day or two. We will be submitting them to the legislature. But another thing we're going to do is we're going to upload them onto a website called Dave's Redistricting app. And that will allow just sort of the average person. It's a really cool app. You can go on and sort of make your own maps. You can start with existing maps. Ours will be an existing map that you'll be able to click onto that'll be publicly available. And those links will be on our website along with the map graphics so that you'll actually be able to go onto the website, Dave's Redistricting app, and sort of have an interactive experience with the map. So that's a really great point. I mean, it's very worthwhile just to understand exactly how much data map makers have at their hands from, you know, the Black population, the white population. Did a precinct vote Republican or Democrat in the last election? I mean, there's just a lot of information, and Dave's Redistricting app will show you exactly how much information is available to map makers. So I think that's a great suggestion, and hopefully some people will take you up on it. I want to thank you again for your extraordinary commitment of time that you've made to the League of Women Voters of South Carolina and to all of the voters in South Carolina. And as we
Well, today I won't say it was my pleasure, but I will say I was happy to do it.
Well, we are super appreciative, and I hope that you're able to get some rest soon, although I know that the map drawing process and the analysis process and the advocacy process is not over. But we really appreciate your commitment to making democracy work. And if we have a few minutes at the end, we're hoping to take a few questions. So if you could just stand by just in case somebody has a question. And then in the meantime, I'm going to introduce my co-chair of the LWVSC Redistricting Work Group, Dr. Matt Saltzman. He is a mathematics professor at Clemson University, and he and his team of graduate students have done a lot of map analysis for us over the past couple of years. And they'll also be analyzing the maps that come out of the legislature, and we'll be releasing that analysis publicly as well.
So to assess partisan bias, there are several different measures that that people have come up with. If you just look at a map and take the voting history of some elections, and then you can assess partisan bias in a few different ways. One way is to compare the average number of votes that a party gets with the median number of votes. And you can think about that, how that works if you think about the distribution of household incomes in the US, where the median income is where half of the households have less and half have more. And the mean is the average. So you add up all of the household incomes, divide by the number of households. And the fact that there's a not small number of households with extremely large incomes pulls the mean up, but doesn't affect the median. And if you think about how that works with elections, what a gap between the median and the mean tends to indicate is that some districts have been packed and others have been cracked. And so you can tell from which direction that goes, which party is being affected. The geometric bias measure is a way of assessing how seats move from party to party as voter preferences shift. And what you would like to see there is that that's balanced between Republicans and Democrats, so that shift in one way and doesn't make it harder for that party to get new seats. And then the efficiency gap we've seen in the news, if you're paying attention, is a comparison of the wasted votes in districts where vote is considered wasted if it was a vote for the losing candidate, and also considered wasted if it was a vote for the winning candidate above and beyond what the candidate needed to win. So you can see that if there's a large number of wasted votes of that latter kind, that's because that's might indicate that that district is packed. And if there's a large number of wasted votes in the other direction, that might indicate that districts are being cracked. So that's where those measurements come from. The other part of what we are interested in doing is the magnitudes of those values depend on a lot of factors. But what we look for when we try to assess whether districts are being engineered is if those are different for the map you're looking at than they would be for other similar maps. And so we run a simulation where we generate lots of different maps and we assess these values for using past election data for all of those maps. And we ask if the map that we're looking at is extremely far and different from the bulk of the maps that we generate. And if you see that, and if you see that maps that have that extreme value are very rare, then you take that can be taken as evidence that the map is engineered. If you don't see that effect, you can still see biases, but it's more likely that they are due to geographic and demographic factors. So what we see here is that the each of these measures are improved from the 2011 map direct measurement compared to the maps that John has drawn for the House. And then we can look at the Senate map next, and we can see that in this case, some of the measures are a little bit worse than the old maps, and some of them are one of them is a little bit better. Part of that is because the demographics have shifted, and so it's a little bit difficult to compare without the rest of the analysis. And part of it is that John wasn't paying attention when he drew these maps, particularly to minimizing partisan bias. So, and then we can see the congressional maps as well show a similar effect where some of the measures are worse and some of them are better. The analysis that we did for the 2011 maps, and it wouldn't surprise me if this turns out to be true for the proposed maps as well, is one of the things we did was compare them to the maps in Pennsylvania before and after the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, where the before maps in Pennsylvania were considered extremely partisan, to reflect extreme partisan bias, and the post decision maps are generally considered to be models of fairness. From the point of view of partisan bias, the measures that the 2011 maps showed up here are actually fairly close to the post-election appearances. And so we don't see in the 2011 maps a strong indication that there was partisan bias. And that's partly, I suspect, due to the fact that we were under pre-clearance in 2011. It's partly due to the fact that that's not really, partisan bias isn't really a key factor to having the election outcomes the way the legislature designed them to be. What's more important here is incumbent protection for the maps that were drawn in 2011, not so much enforcing partisan outcomes. So another point to make here is that we're only working with the statistics associated with prior election outcomes. We're not looking at other aspects of community diversity or protecting communities of interest and so on. And so there are other factors that are likely to affect the outcome of future elections that we can't really pick out here very well. So that's next slide, I guess.
I think we're going to introduce Lynn next, and Lynn is going to talk to us about about what's going on with the legislative timeline and what we can expect, what the league will be doing next, and what voters and those on the call can be doing next. Thank you, Matt.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thank you, John. So much wonderful work has gone into this. And so just briefly to sum up, people very often just focus on looking at the map in terms of what party is likely to win. And if it doesn't seem right to them, they look for statewide partisan gerrymandering. And I think what Matt's work and that of his students and so forth has shown is that happens, but it's not always the big problem. Our maps do not include any attempt to shift partisan outcomes or protect incumbents, but there's still a statewide bias. So that's a product of demography to some extent. But that isn't all that matters in getting responsive personal representation and shaping legislative outcomes. And we want people to think about this more broadly. So yes, it's a question. Is there partisan gerrymandering? Is there racial gerrymandering, which can be measured differently than partisan gerrymandering, either on a statewide basis or in a particular instance? And of course, incumbent gerrymandering, which we think has been South Carolina's pattern. Are important geographic and political units kept intact as much as possible so they can be effectively represented in Columbia and in Washington, D.C.? Do the districts actually include the diversity of people who are part of a community, of a real community, of a county, or has it been picked apart to become safe for an incumbent or a party? And of course, this is, as we've mentioned before, it's a very bipartisan thing. And in fact, very often when you make one district safe for one party, in the same process, you are making the adjacent district more safe for the other party and less safe for voters who actually want their voices to be heard. And of course, we want everyone to pay attention to whether districts are designed to permit minorities to elect a candidate of their choice. And is it narrowly tailored? Because if you do not narrowly tailor these districts as are required by law, the effect is to pack the district and to dilute the influence of that minority. We don't want that. So the legislative process, where are we now? We have one more, the Senate has completed a set of initial public hearings and they've been really very well managed and organized. And I think we all really appreciate that. We think it's our understanding the Senate will have at least one more meeting for input when their draft maps are available for comment. The House is holding public hearings and one of those remains on October 4th here in Columbia. And that one is available for virtual testimony. The Senate has recently set a deadline for public map submissions by October 8th. And there was some discussion at the committee meeting of how that would be done. There's a very efficient portal set up at their redistricting at scsenate.gov website. But in discussion of the committee, it was also pointed out that if people want to submit ideas by email that are not complete state maps, they can do that. I mean, if you just want to say, here's my district and here's where I think it's been carved up badly, you can send that to the redistricting committee and they will take it into account. There's some confusion about the overall schedule. So we know when the Senate wants maps. We don't know when they would actually allow us to see theirs. The House Majority Leader announced this week that they would not be reconvening to discuss redistricting until December. There was an interesting shift when Harvey Peeler, President of the Senate, rescinded a letter saying they were going to reconvene on October 12th. So I'd say neither house has been totally transparent about their intended schedule. Part of that is probably uncertainty, and part of it is probably simply choosing to be more discreet about how they handle this. We don't know when we will see proposed maps. so that the league and many others can evaluate them. But that is very important, that when they do take into account everything they're going to consider, and we do hope they will consider the publicly submitted maps. When they've done everything and they have their drafts, we do want to evaluate them. The big schedule that everyone, I think, keeps in the back of their mind is March 16th is when there's primary filing for elections. And so ideally, not only the process and the vote in the General Assembly, but any litigation ensuing would have to take place by then. So what can you do? Well, local redistricting first. Very often we focus so much on the legislative districts that we forget that it really, really matters what happens at the county and city and school district levels. Please pay attention to those. Ask your county and city council members, your school board commissioners and staff how they plan to draw new districts, what the criteria will be, how they'll solicit public input, and then have your voice heard then. And what can you do right now? Contact your state legislators, your House member, your senator, and ask them for a transparent redistricting process that does not advantage incumbents or parties. Participate in the final public hearing in Columbia for the House. If you haven't already given comments, you can email virtual testimony at schouse.gov to sign up to do that. Contact your U.S. senators and ask them to pass sound Voting Rights Act laws that include protections from gerrymandering, like the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And use the hashtag #WeAreWatching to share redistricting news and advocacy on social media, because that is crucially important. We are watching, and all of you should be watching. We hope you are. We're really grateful that you're here tonight so that we know yes, there is concern, there is interest. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, for the legislative update. We wanted to wrap up about 8 o'clock. We did have one question come through that I thought you might like to answer, Lynn. Will you be submitting testimony with the maps, explaining some of the elements considered in drawing the maps, as Dr. Roof explained tonight? And I know that the league has submitted testimony, and you will be submitting a letter that goes along with our maps. And so if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, we have submitted our criteria as part of our testimony. I think it's gotten through, since the chair of one committee indicated in the committee meeting that he'd heard an awful lot about not having districts shaped for incumbents. So yes, we have already put on file what our criteria are, what we've prioritized, and we will be having a cover letter with our submission. And furthermore, of course, our website has lots of information for anybody else who would like to see where we're coming from, what we're doing.
Right. And the website lwvsc.org, and the redistricting page is linked from the homepage. So you'll be able to get all of this information. Our website director will have it up in the next couple of days. We had several questions come in, and most of them have been answered throughout the evening. But John, if I could ask you one, and it's something that we've talked about a good bit and touched on tonight. When you look at our congressional map, for instance, we talked about with demographic changes in the state that the minority population relative to the white population in the state has decreased. But we still want to protect the opportunity districts and look at districts where a majority minority district could be drawn pursuant to the Voting Rights Act. Can you talk a little bit about if you tried to draw a second opportunity district, like say District 1 in the congressional maps, and if not, why this wasn't really a possibility?
Well, I did some poking around. Now, this is one I'm sure if somebody else takes a different cut at it, they can probably find one. Whether it fits within the league's criteria would be a different issue. Um, you know, the last time around, everybody and their brother-in-law could draw a second majority black congressional district. And nobody at the General Assembly wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And I know there are people who want to know, why can't we do it this time? There ain't enough black people to do it. There is no place in this state where you can draw a second majority black district. I've taken a look at it. Others have taken a look at it. The population dynamics of our state changed substantially between 2011 and 2020. And that is the reality. You know, others may put in a more, not an opportunity district, because I don't think there's an opportunity district there. Others may put in more robust influence districts or an influence district. But within our criteria, we were not headed in that direction. I gave it a shot, but.
Right. Thanks. And I know we didn't say this, but you did have access to racial polarization, bias information, data for South Carolina, and consulted that. I don't know if that's something you want to get into, or if that's too complicated about what that is, and that demographers and.
Well, as the courts have said over the last 20 years, voting in South Carolina is everywhere racially polarized. And, you know, historically, the three tests in a Section 2 case are, can you draw a 50% plus one district? Do black voters usually vote for the same person or for the vote together? And do white voters usually vote as a bloc to defeat the candidates of choice of minority voters? Well, every study I've seen, and I've done them over the years, the courts have relied on mine in making their findings in statewide redistricting litigation. I've looked at some of the preliminary data on South Carolina this time around. And just like the courts have been saying for decades, voting in South Carolina is highly racially polarized. Or as I said the first time I testified in federal court on racial polarization, that I had told a friend of mine I was going to testify at the court that voting in South Carolina is racially polarized, and her response was, well, duh.
Right. So, you know, unfortunately, we do still see the bias for sure, and we can be sharing more of that information going forward. I think we have time for one more question, and you may not have this information off the top of your head, but I'm sure it's a question that a lot of people have. And so if we can't answer it tonight, we will going forward. Again, we were not really factoring in incumbents, except in cases where they were voting rights districts. We were not factoring in incumbent addresses as you drew the maps. Do you know how many current incumbents are put outside of their current district in our maps in the House and or Senate? And if not, if you can talk a little bit about how that's going to happen, regardless, that, you know, unless you're doing pretty extreme gerrymanders with demographic changes, incumbents are going to be paired and put into other people's districts no matter what. And it's just sort of who that happens to. But do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the Senate, districts, I looked at addresses after I'd drawn, and for the most part, all the senators lived in the district that I drew. The different part was that some new districts had to be created, and that means that some legislators had to be put in districts that where there's another incumbent currently. District 35 that is currently in Sumter, Lee, Columbia, maybe Kershaw too. That district was eliminated to move elsewhere. That's Senator Thomas McElveen is the incumbent there. Senator Setzler's district in I remember exactly how many counties he's in. He has probably the most gerrymandered district in the South Carolina Senate today in terms of just the strange look to it. He and Brad Hutto are in the same district under this draw. A place where we put a Democrat and a Republican together in a district is District 17, which now includes, under our plan, would include Newberry and the incumbent Senator Ronnie Cromer and Mike Fanning, who is the incumbent in District 17. And, if you have that much change, you got to put some folks together. What we did not do was decide, well, let's go get these people. We tried to draw our maps, and what came out is what came out.
Right. And I think that's really important. And again, these maps will be available. Voters and attendees tonight will be able to look at the maps and compare them on Dave's redistricting app, where you'll be able to zoom in and see close-ups of your district, down to your precinct boundary and your little neighborhood. So you'll be able to better identify what would happen to your district. Again, these are just our maps. They are one possible version. There is no ideal map, but they are one possible version of what can happen when you use redistricting criteria that is prioritizing voters' interest over incumbent interest. So thank you. And we're just a little bit after 8. So I'm going to end the event, but I want to thank you all for being here. And if you have any questions, please go to our website. The recording will be up soon, and the maps will also be there. And we look forward to working with you. And we hope you'll continue to advocate and use your voice to ask for fair maps in South Carolina. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And we hope to see you at a league event soon. Good night.